Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of our rebooted Oxnard Police Department podcast. We have, of course, the guest for our first episode. We had to make a splash. So please say hello to Police Chief Jason Benites.
Thanks for having me here today, Paul.
Well, this isn't something you naturally do?
No, not really. This is actually, I think, the second time I've done a podcast.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did one a few years back.
It's back in, it's probably like 2021-ish or so.
Yeah.
It came out quite well. I think you did a great job with it.
Well, thank you. We're going to dive into the topic that's been on everybody's mind lately, especially in our community, immigration and immigration enforcement and our role or not role in that, the very fine line that we walk and we find ourselves in. But before we dig into that, let's talk about your experience as a police chief. You've been chief for about almost 5 years now.
Yes, coming up on the end of this year will be 5 years.
Before that, you were assistant chief for 14 years?
Yeah, 14 years.
And then we're going to just rewind it all the way back to you were hired in 93?
Yeah, in November of 1993 was my start date with this department. So this has been my one stop.
That's insane. I'm not the best at math, but I think that's adds up to a 32-year career.
It's coming up on that
Wow.
at the end of the year.
And what got you into it? Is it something you always wanted to do, be a police officer?
I wasn't really entirely sure about that, Paul. I was graduating from college, so I graduated from UCLA at the in the spring of 1992. At that point, I was kind of at a juncture in my life where I was considering a number of different options, and this was one of three. First off, I had thought about, I was a history major in college, and I thought about going down that route and pursuing a graduate degree in graduate studies in that subject. I also looked at considered law school. At that time, it seemed that at that time in my life, it seemed like everybody was going to law school, so I kind of ruled that one out. And then I also considered law enforcement, which was kind of a new thing because nobody else in my family had been in law enforcement, and so it was kind of a whole new frontier.
Wow. And so what kind of made or inspired that final decision? Was it a lot of times when people are considering a career in law enforcement, we tell them, go on a ride along, see what it's like, connect with an officer. Was that kind of your experience?
That was part of it. So right after college, I got a job in a law firm in downtown LA, and I worked there. That was my first job out of college. And during that time, I was doing my search and my look at different agencies, places I wanted to work. And I did some ride-alongs, and I can say that my ride-along here with this department was unlike all the rest. And so at the end of the day, I ended up applying to only 2 municipal law enforcement agencies, and this being one of them.
Wow. And then in a blink, 32 years goes by, right?
Exactly.
How, if we can just get candid, we can, I'm really excited about this podcast platform because we can have conversations about the minutia, but kind of looking back, how has your experience as chief been these past 5 years?
People have asked me that, like what that's like, because it's really, it's in today's world, especially the time when I took this job, it was a time where it was very difficult for police chiefs. And at the time, the average tenure, the expectancy of a police chief was about 2.5 years. There was a huge turnover in this country for that position. And so I took this job right in the middle of the pandemic, on the heels of what was happening following the murder of George Floyd. And so there were a lot of things going on.
Yeah.
And so all things said and done, people have asked me, like, how has your experience been as a police chief? And I'll say I tell people consistently that I give it a 98. It's worked out. I mean, I actually very much enjoy this. I didn't think that I'd ever want to do this job, but it just so kind of turned out that way, and it's been a good experience. But that's not to say that it hasn't been without very significant challenges.
Yeah, 98 on the freshness meter, right?
Yeah, exactly. I say that, Paul. I don't mean overstate, but we've got a good department here.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of that makes that experience that much better. We have good community support here. That makes that even that much better. So, I feel like that stepping into this position, that we're very fortunate to be where we are with this department and this community.
And I'm really interested to look at it from this long lens. From your 32-year career, almost 5 now as a police chief, back to your ride along. Like, if you can compare, I don't know, just before you even started your law enforcement career and doing that ride along and talking to the officer that was driving you around, what can you take away from that?
A lot of things, actually. Without taking up too much time on this, I could probably talk a lot about it. When I signed up for a ride-along, I had actually applied. I'd gone through my first stage of the application, and then during that phase, the staff that was processing the application said to me, "Have you been on a ride-along?" This is right after my first admin interview, and I said, "No, I haven't." Well, the person who said to me, "Well, son, we're going to sign you up for one today." And so that was actually, then he was Sergeant John Cronbach, future Chief Cronbach, walked me right down to the watch commander's office and said, let's sign him up for a ride along. So I think I came back. It was either the next day or the next weekend on a Saturday. And I rode with an officer, and I'll say his name because I actually really credit the reason why I'm here is to him. For just the experience that I had during that ride along. His name is Steve Noguera. He was about a 2-year officer at the time. And so I got my ride along with him. And generally, like to that point, I had kind of felt like I was just an occupant in every other car that I rode in as we went through the ride along. And Steve actually talked to me, and we actually had great conversations about things and saw that we actually had some things in common, saw the world the same way. And, at the end of the ride along, he actually gave me his phone number and said, if you need anything in the process, let me know. And that was a first. So there were also some other things that took place. I saw that it was actually very, very busy here. There was a lot of activity. He was very active, and so I saw the thrill of the job there. And so at one point, what I did think was interesting was we were at a trailer park on just off of South Oxnard Boulevard. And I noticed this is a side of Oxnard I had not seen at this point. And I asked him, I said, it seems like you have a large undocumented population here. He said, how does your department handle that? And he said, well, it doesn't matter to us what anyone's immigration status is. And, I'm a 25-year-old, youngster asking these questions. And I asked him, well, what's the, why? And he said, well, we want victims and witnesses to be comfortable coming forward to talk to us. And having community trust is important to having a police department that is effective. And back then I thought, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
And so that stuck with me ever since. And, fast forward to today, and here we are.
Yeah, let's talk about that. It's interesting that, that was something that kind of I never thought of coming into this role. Was just like, I started as a dispatcher. If somebody calls, needs our help, we're going to go. We don't ask what your status is before we send help. And even today, with everything that's going on, I think it's so important that our community knows that. If you call, we're not going to check your status when we get there. We're not going to check your status if you come forward as a witness, right?
100%. So that has been our practice ever since, as long as I have been here. It never mattered. It never mattered whether a person was a victim, whether a person was a suspect. It just did not matter. Now, with that said, though, I do know that the immigration laws were very different back then. So a person could be arrested back then, and it was after they were booked that they determined that there was a Border Patrol hold on them. So that was a time where those things happened while in the custodial environment. So, I'm not quite sure what happened to them after that, but they were taken to county jail, and it's unclear whether or not, immigration officials would pick them up then. It happened much more freely back then in the custodial environment, such as the jails. But as far as as far as our department was concerned, we didn't participate in any of these types of operations during the entirety of my career where officers would go out and engage in any type of enforcement directly related to immigration. It's just something we didn't do. And, we were a busy enough city as it is, and on top of that, that's federal law. And so, we don't enforce tax codes. We don't enforce those types of things. That it's not our purview to do that. And so that's how it has been for quite some time.
I think that's a question a lot of people have and are unclear on. I know I was, but like the jurisdictional difference between federal police officers and your local police officers. Our Oxnard police officers work here in the city. Many of them live here in the city. And can you talk about just the difference between Oxnard police officers and federal officers?
Yeah, two entirely separate tracks. And so, there's federal law, and federal law is governed by the Supremacy Clause, which is in the United States Constitution. It basically says that federal law generally takes precedent over state laws. So we have that construct. We have state law, all of our penal codes, our health and safety codes, business and profession codes, those things that we as California police officers or peace officers are sworn to enforce. So that is our basically, for lack of a better term, that's our box. And it's not the box in which the federal operations take place. They're two completely separate things. And state officers can't enforce federal law, and vice versa. Federal officers can't enforce state law.
And we can see why that's confusing and a lot of people don't understand it. And there is a lot of blowback on both sides. People, you see it on social media or you hear it around the community. For instance, when you got together with the other police chiefs from the county and released a joint statement about immigration in January, and I know there was some uproar from the community on both sides. But for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, can you just kind of explain what that statement was?
Yeah, certainly. And it's not the first time that the county chiefs or the law enforcement leaders have done this. Back in 2017, when SB 54 came into play, we can talk about that a little bit, but that essentially restricts California law enforcement from engaging in immigration enforcement.
It's a Senate bill.
It is a Senate bill. It became law in 2017. And it's been the law of the state ever since. And that's something we have to abide by. But back then, the county chiefs, it's called the Ventura County Law Enforcement Coordinating Committee. It consists of all the police chiefs in the county, as well as the district attorney and the sheriff. There are some other agencies that are also members, but the participating ones in this statement were the ones I just mentioned. And we essentially said we don't engage in immigration enforcement. That was the heart of the message. Fast forward to this year, on January 17th, we collectively put out a renewed version of that statement, recommitting our position to the public.
Yeah. And what kind of feedback did you get from that statement?
Well, it's been a mixed bag. I mean, I'll say that because it has been a very divisive issue. And if anyone hasn't noticed this, these have been very divided times in our country. And so on this particular topic, California law enforcement has been placed directly in the middle, in the crossfire between both sides of the issue. Mm-hmm. And so generally whenever we make a statement, we are not lining up with people on both sides of the discussion. And that's been part of the big challenge that we're seeing. And I'm pretty sure that there will be things that I tell you during this podcast that will ignite that same type of discussion amongst people. But I think for the most part, generally a large portion of our public understands, but there's both sides of the argument, generally towards the extremes of both sides of the argument, that their position will never change.
You mentioned the fine line we're walking and getting caught between these two. it feels like forces, but it kind of just screams, I manage our social media. It screams the whole police why are you being bodyguards for ICE? Why are you protecting ICE? You're not supposed to be working with them. Can you kind of touch on these instances where we kind of get caught in the middle and, certain community members think that we're on a certain side and it's kind of just, we're doing our job.
Right. Our position is to not take a side here. And so I'll give you a couple examples. We've had a few back in early June where ICE agents were being followed by, I'll just call them community volunteers, or these response networks that have been mobilized by various groups to follow and record immigration officials. And what we were seeing was an increasing concern regarding the behaviors of driving in this. And now I do want to put out there that there is people have a legal right to film authorities conducting their business provided they're not interfering.
Sure.
In certain cases, we had received reports of agents being followed by people that are driving aggressively, or by multiple vehicles, things like that. And so we get called. And so we have two things. We have a duty to respond and we have a duty to investigate. And so generally, when we are placed in situations like that, that means that typically we will contact both of the involved parties or sides of the issue. And during that time, what happens is the officers are speaking to the ICE agents, for example, and that becomes the TikTok moment of collaboration. That becomes the heart of the moment. Setting all other facts aside, the driving, those types of behaviors, but a couple things about that, or at least one thing, is that when somebody calls us, regardless of who they are, whether they are a member of our public, whether they are a member from another agency of some type, we respond. And that's the bottom line. And when we get there, we have a responsibility to try to sort out what happened. I call that duty to investigate. The other part of it is that we are often there to help maintain order or to keep the peace. And you've heard that term, and think a lot of our public's probably heard the term keep the peace on a number of occasions. And so, for example, this goes back to July 10th, and this was the event at St. John's Hospital. This is also the same day for the event at the Glass House.
Sure.
And so, in this particular case, now, for those of you listening, that the incident at the Glass House on Laguna Road was actually outside of Oxnard's jurisdiction, so it wasn't actually in our city. Mm-hmm. However, what happened was Oxnard Fire Department was called to assist with some medical calls at that location, and that's typical for fire to respond outside of their jurisdiction. So Oxnard Fire did respond. There were persons at that scene that had been affected by either impact munitions or by gas that was used on the demonstrators at that location.
By the federal agents.
Yes, correct. And so they were transported, or some may have self-transported to our local hospital in Oxnard at St. John's Regional Medical Center. And so while they were there, our fire crews were outside of the emergency room, and they were tending to these patients. And before they could be brought into the emergency room for treatment, they had to be what they call degassed or decontaminated from the substances that they were exposed to, because a person with tear gas in their clothing could potentially impact the entire emergency room if they were to be brought in.
Right.
So what happened was our fire department was performing that task. And as that occurred, there were a number of demonstrators began to show up at the hospital. And at some point, the fire department said, we need some security here because this is getting to be a concern. And so we responded. And at that point, we placed ourselves between those persons as well as the fire. And our job there is just simply to maintain order, to not take a side, make sure that the situation doesn't escalate. And during that time, federal immigration authorities did show up to the hospital. They had somebody that was under arrest as well, and they were looking to take that person into custody from there.
they have to be medically cleared before they go into custody.
Generally, yeah. And so I'm not entirely familiar with their procedures, but I think it's reasonable to say that before anybody gets booked, it's a wise idea to get them the medical treatment they need or to make sure that they are medically cleared for booking. So now we have a crowd and we have immigration authorities on the other side of this issue trying to gain access to the emergency room. And our job was to stand by and to not get involved. And that's exactly what we did. And our officer's body-worn camera shows that. You may have seen some reels or some videos or some live feeds from the hospital, but our officers were there just simply to stand in between.
And then the narrative gets pushed that Oxnard police officers are working as security for ICE as ICE is ripping people out of the hospital. Right?
Correct. Yep.
Wow. How do you, when the public asks, what is the police department doing to protect our community from ICE? What happens if ICE comes in and we call you to step in? Like, can we do that, or what do you tell people?
Well, we can certainly respond to calls where people, have a concern. Like I mentioned, we would respond. But I think really there's a couple things that people, that is essential to understand is that they are federal authorities, and under existing framework of law, they have the authority to do this enforcement. And we lack the authority to give them direction or to give them orders or to even stand in their way or to obstruct them. In fact, it actually would be a federal offense for our officers or anyone for that matter to stand in the way to physically obstruct or prevent or thwart agents from performing the duties that they are carrying out. And I think you may have seen this, and our public may have seen this. We've seen judges that have been arrested by immigration officials for obstructing or hindering the efforts of these agents. And so there's that out there. And so people, in my discussions with members of the public, people have actually expressed that expectation that is what we should be doing. And in that case, what they're asking is essentially for us to violate federal law,
sure,
subject our officers to arrest and whatever repercussions come for our city after that.
Yeah. It's frustrating and it's a challenge because we feel the passion and the fear of the public. But again, we're up against it. And we as a department we value our connection and our relationship to our community. It's one of our core values as a department. It's something we've done. We've just put so much emphasis on is building relationships. And something that just is super frustrating is how, when ICE comes into our city and then they leave us, they have no responsibility to our community like we do. And so if there ever comes a day when this immigration enforcement and this all boils over, ICE is gone, we're still here. And that's a challenge that we are dealing with. And in what ways or what efforts are you making moving forward to, I don't know if there even is a way to not collaborate, but, tell ICE or tell the federal agents what our concerns are in our community.
Well, I see what you're saying. I mean, we have a long existing relationship with our community here. And when I say that, I really want to put emphasis on the fact that over the past near generation, we have been really focusing on local hiring. So we have officers here whose families are under a lot of anxiety and duress right now. When I was younger in my career, about 25 years ago, I would say that the percentage of Latino officers that worked at this department was in the low to mid 20th percentile. So call it 23% ish. We're at about 56% of our our sworn workforce is of Latino origin now. Now, when I say that, I know of officers that have families that are here that are not documented. We have people whose extended relatives are in that position. So with that, I can tell you that, and it's not just Oxnard. It's almost any police department. There's a level of empathy and understanding for what the people that we work with are going through. So when you have the feds, now they have a job to do. And it's very different because there's not that community connectivity that it exists. And so they come in, they do what they do, and they leave. And generally, there's the aftermath that the community does feel after those operations. And so, it's understandably very distressing on our communities. It's very distressing for this community. And with our role, it has been very challenging because our hands are tied. Now, on one side of the coin, we don't engage in this type of enforcement, but the other side of the coin is that we have absolutely zero authority to actually direct or stop or even see if ICE can change its tactics. Mm. We have no steering input on that.
Right.
And so that has been very tough for us because there's that, but there's also an expectation on some members of our public that we do intervene and that we do actually things that prevent them from doing their jobs. And that's therein lies, I think, the core of the problem. One example would have to do with things like wearing masks. Now, California police officers, law enforcement, sworn officers, generally we don't wear masks, right? But there's this issue. That's one of the issues that's out there right now. It's not so much here in Oxnard or Ventura County, but I've seen it in Los Angeles, and I've heard of calls there. They're encountering people that may or may not have proper identifiers for their agency. They're wearing masks and they're carrying guns. There's been some efforts at the state level to try to mandate law enforcement operating in California to either unmask, or show their proper credentials. That's, I believe it's Senate Bill 805 and 627 that are currently going through the California legislature. Now, granted that, say those things do pass, I think the feds would say that that's mildly interesting. It doesn't apply to us.
Right.
State has no authority over this. Back to what I was talking about with the supremacy clause, is that federal law generally takes precedent over state law, and so that's one of those big things out there.
What have you seen, or have you seen at all, an impact on our patrol officers out in the field doing their day-to-day duties? Mm.
So we go to briefings, we sit in with the officers, kind of hear about what's happening, and some of the sense that we get. Well, I see a gamut of different things that they are experiencing, and they're doing traffic stops just as they normally do for speeders or whatever other typical enforcement that they're undertaking. And from what they're saying is that they're stopping cars, and within minutes they've got small crowds gathering around them, jeering at them, giving them a hard time. So there's that, because there may be those that think that they are there to, enact some type of immigration enforcement, which they're not, as we've repeatedly said. And then the other side of the coin, the other extreme, generally deals with situations like they would see like at St. John's, or, for example, the officer responding to a report of ICE agents being followed by, a reckless driver, just getting berated by that person. They're seeing some of that. And I wouldn't say that it's become commonplace for that type of extreme to take place, but it's happening. Mm. And when you see what happened at St. John's, you'll see people come up to them and start yelling at them and saying some pretty unpleasant things to them. And, and they've done a really good job about just standing by and remaining professional.
Again, at the end of the day, once the feds leave the city, our officers are still here protecting and serving.
Exactly.
What are you doing? What kind of community efforts have you been making an effort to cultivate over the past couple of months?
So we've started this going back to actually January, when we kind of saw what the situation was likely to become. So we started back on the 17th of January with a collective statement to the public about our position of non-involvement in immigration enforcement operations. So we've taken that to share that, be sure to share that message with a variety of different community organizations. There's a long list of organizations that we have we've expressed this to. Mm-hmm. But what I'm seeing here is that we've also had our outreach on social media, which you've been a big part of, where we've actually gone out to do some messaging to the public. And the other part of this has to do with our engaging various organizations, one organization at a time, where we can actually sit down and actually have a discussion, versus a large group with, 80 people plus, where, it might not be so conducive to a discussion. So we've met with a number of different community groups, and we're continuing that trajectory as we go through this. We've been trying to be very especially diligent about sharing information with them about what's going on and what really happened when something does happen. Try to debunk some of the myths that have been placed out there, some of the narratives of collaboration, some of the narratives of what people are saying that we do, and telling people what actually happened. We did an interfaith forum back in May, which had about 100 plus people from the faith community, and we actually talked about what some of the facts are. We showed pictures of what our officers' uniforms look like versus what that of the federal immigration agents would look like, so people know. Because I think they often get those conflated, that they see those, and it's hard for just like the average person to say, oh yeah, that's this. So we've done that. We have some more meetings scheduled. Last week, our mayor called together about a dozen or so groups, and we sat down and we actually had some discussion back and forth about the state of things. And one thing we were trying to do is really try to drive home what our role is, what our role isn't, and what we can and can't do. And that's especially important for people to understand.
Yeah. You mentioned social media and the messaging, and a lot of times after an event like St. John's, or people will ask, why isn't Chief putting out a statement? Why can't we get, something written in black and white from the Chief? But we're facing challenges, as it seems like every day there's new revelations, something else is unrolling.
That's a good point, actually. We have to be very judicious and cautious about statements that we are putting out, because of exactly that. The situation in our country, the situation in our state concerning immigration enforcement is very, very fluid. And when I say this, I mean that like on a Monday, we could say something and commit very, very firmly to a position, and then on Wednesday that might have shifted. And so the consequence of something like that is for us those persons that didn't maybe see the shift would immediately assume that we are being deceptive, or in fact we're just straight out lying to the public.
And it's not a shift that originates with us. It's
right.
Something that's passed down from the administration.
Generally, yes. So like a change in position, for example, when back to January, is our impression that the administration was going after a smaller subset of persons with immigration enforcement. And as time progressed, by the time we got to mid-June, that had very clearly shifted. Mm. And so when you see some of the other things that are happening in our communities where the enforcement has turned more along the lines of sweeps, that's different. And so things are changing. The strategies that are being used for immigration enforcement are shifting. would go so far to say that they are working to circumvent SB 54 at some point. So it's really unclear like what the path is there.
Yeah. Well, Chief, I asked you for 30 minutes of your time, and I'm sorry. I think I've gone way over. But before we say thank you and goodbye to everybody who's out there listening, do you have any other closing thoughts or message you'd like to put out there?
I think the best thing for our community is to know that this has been a very difficult issue. We are very empathetic to our public that this has been tough. This is very tough. In fact, I can say that in my near 32 years that this has been one of the more challenging things that we have dealt with our police department and our community. This has put us kind of directly in the middle of the issue. And I know that whatever we say, persons on either side of the argument will still not either accept what we're saying or they will not believe it. But I want you to know that, we are committed to serving our community here. Our officers genuinely do care about the people that they serve in Oxnard. And I think that's one of the greatest strengths that we have here. The people that work for this department are largely a big part of this Oxnard community to begin with, and they do care. And we are in a position where we operate by the rule of law. So that is the box, and that's the construct from which we work. The rule of law, the way things are, the established rules, and we have to be, as police officers, we have to be rule followers. We can't break the rules. And that's even if we don't agree with the rules or we downright detest the rules. That's neither here or there. And it's not our position to express a position on or an editorial position on laws. Things can change. And when those rules change, that changes the construct from which we work. But as things are happening in our country, the way things are going to change are going to either be through litigation that goes up through the courts all the way up to the Supreme Court, or changes in the existing laws. Those are the laws of the land. And so with that is where our position starts. What we can commit to our Oxnard residents, that our officers will be professional, they will be objective, and they will be empathetic to the community that we serve. That's a promise.
Very well said. Thank you again for your time, Chief. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen to this conversation. And if you want to hear more, again, this was the first episode. Pleasure, honored to have you, Chief Benites. But keep in the conversation. Make sure you subscribe on whatever podcast platform you enjoy the most. And we'll keep it going here on the Oxnard Police Department podcast. Thanks, everybody.